the data interchange. Before we talk about anything about data interchange, considering a question or scenario, like you have a program and you output some like data. And this was in the JavaScript object format. What if you want to have this data input into another program that is written in Python or C or Java, like other languages? So what can we do? So this is why we had these standard interfaces for data. So sometimes this is also called data serialization. But when you heard like the term data serialization, you know it's the same as what we mentioned here, like standard interface for data. So in the world of software, we may have different components. We have components written in Python, components written in JavaScript, and other components. So we also want these components to communicate with each other. So for example, you have front end developed in JavaScript, and the data that you want to transform into your backend. Your backend is unfortunately written in Python. So we need some kind of interchange in between of that. So this is why we need a data interchange format. And there are three popularly used data interchange formats, which are JSON, YAML, and XML. So we have seen JSON, right? So you might be familiar with JSON now, I hope. So we use them to represent data structure and values. And we can also use them to enable data storage, transfer, distribution, often used in configurations. So what are they? What are the difference? When should I use XML? When should I use JSON? Or when should I use YAML? Before we discuss the difference between them, I will explain what are they, and then we'll compare them and know when should we use which of them. So first of all is JSON. So the full name of JSON is actually JavaScript Object Notation. It may give you the impression that JSON is only used for JavaScript, but it's not that case. So you can. So the language looks very similar to JavaScript. So let's have a look at our JSON file from previous lectures. So here was our JSON. I'll make it larger. So this was the JSON file that we had before. It looks very similar to a JavaScript object. So we had like key and values, but you can also note that there are some also differences. For example, the key in a JavaScript object, they do not have quotes, right? So they are written like name and then directly what else, like the value of name. But in JSON file, like in JSON data structure, we have the quotes for the keys. So this is the first difference in the syntax. Another difference in the syntax is that we do not have the trailing comma, so we cannot have a comma here, and we cannot have a comma here. But in JavaScript object, we can have that trailing comma. So this is the difference in the syntax. Any questions so far? All good? Yep. And there are also other differences. For example, JavaScript is a programming language. Like you can run it, and it can give you some output. Like you can console log something, and there are also some method in it. So the JavaScript is a programming language. So same with C and Python. But JSON is not a programming language. It's a markup language. So it's used to store some data. You can think of it like CSV file. You can think of it like doc file. You can think of it like XML file. So it's not a programming language. So JSON is used to storing data. So this is how JSON looks like. Eric said we have seen Jason. Yeah, we have some friends called Jason. My son is called Jason as well, but it's different. It's very similar to JavaScript syntax we just seen. And here's the summary of what I just mentioned. And we do not have trailing comma after the 2033. JSON is very popular for many reasons. First of all, generally it's easy to read. It does not have like additional syntax in it. You just put information in it and you use some brackets. And also it's compatible with many different languages like Python, like JavaScript. This language have built-in libraries to write and read JSON. So you can use JavaScript's built-in function or library to write a JSON file and then use Python to read that JSON file. So JSON file can like a data interchange, like in between of different programming languages. Okay, so here's an example. Let's have a look. So this is a JavaScript object, and this object's name is data structure. JSON.it. Yep, here it is. Remembering that when we talk about NPM, we installed external libraries using npm install, and then we can import that library from, like, for example, import data function from data function, remembering from that lecture. But we also mentioned in that lecture, in addition to external libraries that we need to install, there are also a couple of built-in libraries. And one most commonly used is the file function, like file fs library. It's a built-in library in JavaScript, we always say built-in in Node.js. And we do not need to install fs when we want to use it. We can import from directly, and we can use it. So, how do we know how to use this file, like fs library? Like, how can we use that to read and write? The easiest thing, not easy, but most straightforward way we can do is search on Google. There's always no shame to search on Google. Like, we can do fs write file. How can we use this library to write? And then we can get some hints. For example, here, like they tell us we can use fs.write file. And we can also get some more official documents on how to use fs. For example, here is from the node.js file. Let's find something like write. We want to write to it. And here we find it. Okay, so I'm not going to read through them. I will just quickly show you how we use them. So the way we use that is called fs.write file. And the syntax here is we need to specify where we want to write to. So we need to give a file name or a directory. And this file doesn't necessarily to have been existed before. So you can give it the name, and then when you call this fs.write file sync, they will create this file for you and write the content into this file. Okay. And the data that you want to write to this JSON file. And then flag is write. So W means it's write, but this one is optional because the default option for flag is write for write file sync. Okay, so now you may have a question like, what is this JSON.string file? What is it? Like, why do we have to JSON.string file this data before we store it in this JSON file? So let's have a try console log this data and have a look. What is it?
So they have to be in the same folder, same directory.
Which one needs to be in the same directory?
The current JavaScript file with the JSON file.
Yeah, but you can also specify a different directory, but you need to specify where you want to save it to. Cool, so let's run this. Do you remember how to run JS file? What? What? It's called node, right? We use node to run JS file, and this file is called 3.1 JSON -8-j.js, and this is what being console logged. And I've console logged this data, so this is what has been stringified from the JavaScript object. Is it too small? Can you see clearly from the back? So this is what has been stringified. The reason that we need to JSON stringify this object before we write to file is because JSON file actually stores strings. So there's no structure in JSON file. So in JavaScript we have object, and you can think of like objects, arrays, and everything. But in JSON file, it doesn't have that structure. So everything in a JSON, you can think of it like only strings. So we need to JSON stringify that JavaScript object before we write it to a JSON file.
Sorry, what's
JSON
JSON?
stringify is here. Like we need, so data structure is the JavaScript object, and we use JSON.stringify to make this JavaScript object into a string, as we just console logged here. And then we save this data in the file called export.json. So now you can see that I have a new file here. It's created while I run the node, the file, and then when I call the function like fs. Here it where. Yeah. Sorry, I accidentally closed. Here is it. So what we can do, like we can change it. So we can have AAA, BBB, and randomly change some of them. And then we run this again. And you can see in this export.json file, it's also being updated. So this is how we write to a JSON file. And it's stored. What's stored in this JSON file is actually a string. Yep. Any questions so far?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, when you write to the file, I'm guessing that if you don't have the file, it shouldn't. But if you put the name, you just create the name, the file with that name. But if let's say the file already exists, it will just write over it.
Yes, that's right. That is right. Cool. So now we have write to a JSON file. So what if we are given a JSON file? Like this JSON file is from another piece of code, like another module of software, and you want to read this JSON file into a JavaScript object, and then you can like use that JSON, like this JavaScript object for your program. So the function that we can use is called fs.readFileSync, and you read from this export.json file. And you also have a flag called R, which means read, but you can also remove this because it's optional. It's the default for the flag in a read file sync. And similarly, like we had JSON.stringify when we write to a JSON file. Now we have a JSON.parse when we read from a JSON file. So let's try that. So here is it. What if I want to read from that, and then I console log this JSON that parsed JSON file? So you can see that after the JSON.parse, the data is again reformed into an object structure instead of like what we saved in the JSON file, like a string without structure. So this is how we read and write using with JSON files. Cool?
I have a question.
Yep.
What if like the file does not exist and you try to read file?
You will receive an error message.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't exist.
Yes, because it doesn't exist. Yeah. That's right. So the next one is called YAML. We are going to use YAML for, sorry, question?
What if we don't call JSON that stringify before we store it into the JSON file?
What will happen if we do not have JSON stringify before we say, like, write to the JSON file? Good question. So what about we have a try, like just save this data structure straight away without JSON stringify and see what happens. So we see that you received an error message, and it will basically say that you stored an invalid data type, that you cannot save objects data directly into your JSON file. Yeah.
Is it because the data is in like some data type that you can't really read with a human? Like, if you don't stringify it, you can't really read what's the data. You just
So there are a couple of ways to think of that. So first is the syntax. So like when you use fs.file write file sync, it requires you to input a string data. So if you have object here or array here, if you like an error message. Another way to think of it is because when we communicate with like a server, like using a JSON file, we need to use strings.
Oh, because this is an array of objects, that's why it doesn't accept.
Yes.
It needs to be a string.
Yes, it needs to be a string. Okay, YAML. So, okay, YAML. YAML is very, very similar to JSON, but it looks different. We will use YAML in our second lecture today, but now let's just have a look at how it looks like. You can see that syntax is different from JavaScript, it's different from JSON file. And also here, identification also matters. So how can you know whether you have written a well-identified YAML file? So there are a lot of tools online. Like for example, so this is how I make sure that my YAML file is written properly. It's by Googling online like YAML validator. So a lot of online YAML validators. For example, let's try, what about this first one? Doesn't look like a very user-friendly one. Okay, let's just randomly use one. They are basically very similar. So let's use the one from our slide. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste. Oops. This is not a good one. What about this first one? What else we can have? YAML formatter. What about this one? Okay, this one looks better. So I'm going to copy the code like we have on the slide here. And I'm going to pass it here. So you can see the error message because I didn't format it properly. And it will help you format your YAML file with proper indents. So here, and here's an error message because I need to have blanks before postcodes. So this is how it looks like. So when you use a random text editor, it might not remind you like whether you have been using a proper format, but there are a lot of tools that help you with that. You can also have like having a JSON file and converting to a YAML file, converting to a JSON file using these tools. This one doesn't work well, but I can find JSON YAML, JSON to YAML. So you can just find a random one. It doesn't really matter. So you can see how you input a JSON file and then it automatically converts it to a YAML file. So both of them are used to storing data and can store in similar type of data, but they have different syntax. You can see that YAML file is actually more condensed, right? Do not have that many brackets, and also easier to read. So JSON here is corresponding to JSON here, YAML here corresponding to YAML here. So you can see the different structures here. So the different syntax here. The last one for the data interchange data type is called XML. Much more complex, looks much more complex, this one, right? So we have like roots, postcode, suburb, like postcode between 2032 and postcode with a like dash after 2032. It looks much more complex and it's also less used these days. We are not going to use XML file in this course, but if you've seen any XML file, you know that it's similar to JSON file or XML. It's called XML. It's not HTML, it's XML. So what's the difference? So here's a summary of what are they. And all these three mentioned serialization language, or we say data interchange language, has the same extensions as their name. For example, YAML, that .yaml for YAML. Sometimes you can also see .yml. So they are the same, like either .yml or .yaml. They are like both of them works. So .yml is a more like conventional way of and JSON for JSON, XML for XML. So it's easy to remember. XML is a markup language, but JSON and YAML are actually data formats, like how you store the data formats. And they also, like JSON and YAML also have different styles. JSON use the tabs, like the brackets, while YAML use the happen, like we have seen the dash, and also white spaces. And we also have seen in the example that XML files are a little bit more difficult to read, but JSON file and YAML file are easier to read and interpret. And yeah. And JSON is better as a serialization format, like save data and use in between of different components. But YAML is more suitable for configurations. We'll use YAML in the following lecture, and you will see how we use that. Okay, cool. Great. So this is all about data interchange. We're not going very deep with like either YAML or JSON or XML in this course, but we will use them. Like we have used the JSON file already. Like we have like npm install. Like we have seen package.json, and we will also use YAML files. But we are not going to use XML files. So you do not need to go very deep into those. You only need to know that these three languages are for data interchange, and they can be used to store data. That'll be enough. Cool. Thank you. Let's have a break.